In the forgotten corners of an ancient town, where the streets twisted like the gnarled roots of a tree, there lay a house. Not just any house, but the house, the one that children whispered about at dusk, the one that adults avoided with a quiet fear they could never fully explain. Its crumbling walls were choked with ivy, its windows dark and lifeless, like empty eye sockets staring into the void. The townsfolk had long since given up on trying to sell it, to rent it, or even to demolish it. They said it was cursed, a place where shadows lived, where the air hung heavy with a sense of dread that seeped into the very bones of those foolish enough to approach. But no one spoke of what truly lay within, because those who had ventured too close, those who had dared to listen, were never the same again. It was a stormy night when it began. Truly began. The kind of night where the wind howled like a wounded beast, and the rain fell in sheets, lashing against the cobblestones and rattling the windows of every house. But in that ancient, forgotten home, the weather outside was the least of anyone's concerns. Emily, a woman in her late 20s, had always been drawn to the macabre. Her fascination with the occult, with the things that lurked in the dark, had led her to this town. She was a journalist, or at least that was the excuse she gave when people asked why she was here. In truth, Emily was a seeker, searching for the stories that no one else would tell, the horrors that others would prefer to leave buried. And the house had called to her, like a whisper in the back of her mind, pulling her closer and closer until she could no longer resist. The key to the front door was old, rusted, and cold to the touch, like it had been waiting for years, centuries even, to be used again. When she turned it, the door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls, a sound that seemed to reverberate through time itself. The air inside was thick, stale, and carried with it the faint scent of decay. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, as if stirred by unseen hands. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the storm's roar and leaving her in a silence so profound it felt as though the house had swallowed her whole. Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she began to explore. Every step she took echoed, the sound bouncing off the walls and returning to her, distorted, like a voice trying to speak. The living room was the first place she examined. It was a relic from another time, with furniture draped in white sheets, like specters waiting for their final rest. A grand piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed and cracked, but somehow, it seemed almost new compared to the rest of the room. She reached out to touch it, and as her fingers brushed the ivory, a note rang out, soft, but unmistakable. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The note lingered in the air, fading slowly, as if it had been played by invisible hands. She stepped back, her flashlight beam wavering as her hand shook. The house seemed to hum with a life of its own, the walls pulsing, as if the building itself were breathing, alive in a way that defied explanation. She moved deeper into the house, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain, as though someone was guiding her. The hallway was long, lined with old portraits of grim-faced men and women, their eyes following her as she passed. Each face was a portrait of misery, of lives cut short by some unseen hand, their stories lost to time. Yet, as she looked closer, she noticed something strange. The faces, once static, seemed to shift in the dim light, their eyes widening, mouths twisting into silent screams. Her pulse quickened as she turned a corner and came to a door at the end of the hall. It was different from the others, smaller, more unassuming, but it radiated a cold that she could feel even from several feet away. Her hand reached out, trembling, and grasped the doorknob. It was ice cold, sending a shiver up her spine as she twisted it and pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, illuminated only by the faint glow of a single, flickering candle. The walls were lined with old books, their spines cracked and worn, covered in dust. But it wasn't the books that drew her attention. It was the figure hunched over a table in the center of the room. The figure was draped in a tattered cloak, its back to her, its form barely visible in the weak light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The figure didn't move, didn't react to her presence, as if it hadn't noticed her. Or perhaps it was simply waiting for her to come closer. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered above the figure's shoulder. She hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run, to flee this place and never look back. But something held her there, something stronger than fear, curiosity, or perhaps the same unseen force that had drawn her to this house in the first place. She placed her hand on the figure's shoulder, and in that instant, everything changed. The candle flickered violently, its flame turning a sickly green as the temperature in the room plummeted. The figure slowly turned its head to face her, and as it did, Emily felt a wave of cold wash over her, seeping into her bones, freezing her in place. The face that met hers was not human, not anymore. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light, its skin pale and stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The thing's breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale releasing a cloud of mist in the frigid air. And then it spoke. A voice that was not a voice, a sound that was more like a whisper in the darkest corner of her mind. The words were unintelligible at first, a cacophony of sound that made her head ache, her vision blur. But slowly, they began to take shape, to form words that she could understand. "Welcome," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice, with an ancient, malevolent hunger. "I've been waiting for you." Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear, by the cold, by the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the room. The figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers like talons, and as it touched her, a shock of pain shot through her body, like ice water being poured into her veins. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pain was gone. The room was empty again. The figure vanished, the candle extinguished. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She turned and fled the room, slamming the door behind her as she raced down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the dark. But the house was not done with her yet. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all she could hear, drowning out her thoughts, her sense of reality. They spoke of things she could not understand, of horrors beyond comprehension, of a darkness that had been waiting, watching, and now, finally, had found its prey. As she reached the front door, she realized with dawning horror that it was locked, the key she had used nowhere to be found. The whispers were closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker, as if the house itself was alive, hungry, and she was trapped inside it, with no way out. Emily's hands trembled as she fumbled with the door, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The darkness behind her seemed to pulse, pressing closer with every passing second. The whispers, those horrible, unrelenting whispers, were now so loud that they felt like they were coming from inside her own mind, twisting her thoughts, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She pounded on the door, her fists striking the wood with desperate force. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice breaking. But the house remained silent, its ancient walls absorbing her cries like a sponge. There was no answer, no sound except the relentless storm outside and the maddening whispers that refused to let her go. Emily spun around, her back pressed against the door as she tried to steady herself. Her flashlight had slipped from her grasp in the chaos, its weak beam flickering feebly on the floor before sputtering out, plunging the hall into complete darkness. She was alone in the pitch black, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. But then, from the darkness, something began to emerge. A shape, vague and undefined at first, but growing clearer as it moved closer. It was a shadow, darker than the rest, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. It twisted and writhed, as if struggling to take form, but there was no mistaking the malevolence that radiated from it. Emily's breath hitched as the shadow took on a vaguely humanoid shape, its limbs elongated and unnaturally thin, its face a void of nothingness that seemed to suck in the surrounding darkness. It reached out with a long, shadowy arm, and as it did, The whispers intensified, growing into a deafening roar that made her head throb with pain. She wanted to run, to flee into the night and never look back, but her body refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, her legs numb, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. The shadow loomed over her, its presence suffocating, as if it was absorbing every last bit of air in the room. Suddenly, the shadow moved, and in an instant, it was upon her. Its cold, tendril-like fingers wrapped around her throat, lifting her off the ground with an inhuman strength. Emily clawed at the air, her vision blurring as the blood pounded in her ears. The whispers became a cacophony, a symphony of madness that filled her mind, drowning out everything else. She could feel the life being squeezed out of her, the coldness spreading through her veins, numbing her to the core. But just as she was about to give in, to let the darkness take her, something shifted. The whispers faltered, just for a moment, as if something had disrupted their sinister rhythm. In that brief pause, Emily heard something else, a sound, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a voice, a real voice, cutting through the madness like a knife. It was coming from behind her, from the other side of the door she had been trying to escape through. The voice was calling her name, pleading, desperate. "Emily, Emily, wake up." She blinked, her vision clearing for just a moment, and she saw the door. It was still there, solid and real, but now it seemed closer, as if the house itself was shifting, distorting the surrounding space. The shadow's grip loosened, and she could breathe again, the cold receding just enough for her to regain control of her body. With a surge of strength she didn't know she had, Emily kicked out, her foot connecting with something solid, and the shadow recoiled, its grip faltering. She fell to the floor, gasping for air, the whispers receding like a tide. The darkness seemed to pull back, as if retreating from the light that was now streaming through the cracks in the door. Emily scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she reached for the door handle. It was still locked, but now, through the thin wood, she could hear the voice more clearly. It was her friend, Anna, who had come with her to the town but had stayed behind, unwilling to enter the house. "Emily, please, open the door." With a cry of desperation, Emily yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The shadow was still there, lurking just out of sight, its presence a constant, oppressive weight on her mind. But the voice, Anna's voice, was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink. "Emily, you have to wake up. It's not real." "Wake up?" The words echoed in her mind, cutting through the fog of fear and confusion. "Not real?" She shook her head, trying to make sense of it, but the shadow was moving again, its form shifting, growing darker, more solid. It reached for her, its fingers stretching out like claws, and this time, she could feel the cold, the bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into her very soul. But the voice, Anna's voice, was still there, growing louder, more insistent. "Emily, wake up. It's just a dream." A dream? The thought hit her like a jolt of electricity, and suddenly, everything began to change. The surrounding walls started to dissolve, the oppressive darkness peeling away like old paint. The shadow recoiled, its form blurring, losing its shape as if it was being pulled apart by an unseen force. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, the whispers now fading into nothingness, replaced by the sound of Anna's voice, clear and strong. "Wake up, Emily. Wake up." And then, with a gasp, she opened her eyes. Emily's eyes flew open, her body jerking upright as if yanked from the depths of a nightmare. She was no longer in the dark, oppressive confines of the house. Instead, she found herself lying on a cold, hard floor, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The room was dimly lit, but it wasn't the eerie, malevolent darkness she had just been engulfed in. It was familiar, grounded in reality. Anna was there, kneeling beside her, her face etched with worry. "Emily, oh, thank God," she cried, her voice trembling with relief. She reached out, grabbing Emily's shoulders, shaking her slightly as if to confirm that she was really awake. Emily blinked, trying to shake off the lingering fog of the dream. Was it a dream? Asterisk. But the memory of the shadow, the whispers, and the cold fingers around her throat were still vivid, as if they had been real. Her skin still tingled with the icy touch, and the echo of those dreadful whispers lingered in the back of her mind. What happened? Emily managed to gasp, her voice hoarse, her throat raw as if she had been screaming. She looked around, trying to piece together her surroundings. They were in a small room, the walls lined with old, crumbling bookshelves, and a single, flickering bulb hung from the ceiling. It was the same room where she had found the figure at the table, but now it was different, emptier, less threatening. Anna's face paled as she looked at Emily, her eyes wide with fear. "You've been out for hours. I found you here, on the floor, just staring blankly at nothing. You weren't responding, and I couldn't wake you up. It was like you were in some kind of trance." Emily shuddered, the reality of Anna's words sinking in. "It felt so real," she whispered, rubbing her temples, trying to ease the pounding in her head. "There was something here, a shadow, and it was trying to kill me." Anna's expression hardened, and she nodded, as if she had been expecting something like this. "This place isn't just any house, Emily. It's a trap. It feeds off fear, off the darkness inside people. I tried to warn you, but you wouldn't listen. You were so determined to find the story." Emily looked down at her hands, still trembling, as the memories of what she had experienced came rushing back. The whispers, the faces in the portraits, the figure that had spoken to her, welcoming her into its clutches. She could still hear its voice, low and malevolent, echoing in the recesses of her mind. "I don't think it was just a dream," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it was something more, something real." Anna squeezed her shoulder, her grip firm. "We need to leave now," she urged, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This place, whatever it is, whatever power it holds, it's dangerous. We've overstayed our welcome, and I'm not going to lose you to it." Emily nodded, the fear that had been gnawing at her finally breaking through the last of her stubborn resolve. "You're right," she murmured, her voice still shaky. "Let's get out of here." With Anna's help, Emily got to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady. The house seemed to watch them as they moved through it, the silence oppressive, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the dim light overhead, felt like a threat, like the house was deciding whether to let them go or to keep them trapped within its walls forever. They made their way down the hallway, past the portraits that now seemed to leer at them, their eyes following their every move. Emily avoided looking too closely, afraid of what she might see if she did. The door at the end of the hall, the one she had so desperately tried to open earlier, was now slightly ajar, the outside world just a few steps away. Anna pushed the door open, and a gust of cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth. They stepped outside, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight that had been bearing down on them lifted, like a shroud being pulled away. The storm had passed, leaving the town bathed in a pale, ghostly moonlight. The house behind them loomed dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes watching them go. Emily turned back to look at it, a shiver running down her spine. It stood there, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. The house was alive, in its own twisted way, and it had almost claimed her. "Come on," Anna urged, pulling her away. "We're not staying here another minute." They hurried down the cobblestone street, leaving the house, and whatever horrors it held, far behind. The town was eerily quiet, the only sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Emily's mind was still reeling, the line between reality and nightmare blurred. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never return to that house again. As they reached the edge of the town, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky with a faint, hopeful light. Emily paused, taking one last look back at the ancient town, the house now just a shadow in the distance. She could still feel its pull, a lingering presence that seemed to beckon her back, but she resisted. It was over. The story she had sought was one she would never write, one that would remain buried in the depths of her mind, a secret she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But as she turned to leave, a final, chilling thought crossed her mind. The house was still there, waiting, watching, ready for the next unfortunate soul who would hear its whisper in the shadows. And it would wait for as long as it took.